Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to a talk about one of the most underserved areas of all of Flutter, and that is desktop. More specifically, we'll be talking about what you need to keep in mind if you set out to build widgets for desktop, widget kits for desktop. My name is Matt Carroll. I'm a former member of the Flutter team from 2018 to 2020, and since 2020, I've been working as a contract developer, open source developer, consultant, and educator for all things Flutter and Dart. So let's jump in. I'd like to start off today by convincing you that desktop is king. Now, this may not be the case financially these days. The mobile industry moved a whole lot of money, but I'd like to just give you a sampling of some of the things people do on desktop, and I'd like for you to consider the depth of these capabilities. So what kind of things do we do on desktop? Well, we do all sorts of bitmap manipulation with Photoshop, vector graphics with Illustrator, video editing with Premiere, special effects with After Effects. And this isn't just an Adobe show here. We also have DaVinci Resolve for video editing. We have Rive for all things vector and raster animation and interaction these days. And as a reminder, that user interface is built with Flutter. The app that all of you use to design the mobile apps that you then build with Flutter, Figma, is on desktop. We take notes in Obsidian on desktop. We take notes with Bear on desktop. In fact, there's kind of a burgeoning industry for desktop note-taking apps. We talk to each other over things like Discord or Slack. We listen to music with Spotify, and then maybe some of us create music with Ableton, or FL Studio, or Logic Pro. And of course, we all code with either Android Studio or VS Code. All of those things happen on desktop. The coolest, the most important, and the most impactful things we do still happen on a desktop computer. So what if we want to build a desktop app with Flutter for our user interface? What kind of widgets do we have to choose from? Well, our first stop, as we all know, is here. This is Material. And in Material, everything is huge, everything is super round, and we've got all these pastel colors everywhere. And frankly, if you use the default settings, it looks more like a child's coloring book than it does a serious desktop application. Now, this is not a surprise. These components were optimized for mobile, and on mobile, you want more color and you want bigger things. That's fine. But where does that leave us for desktop? Our other option out of the framework, of course, is Cupertino. And I would say the color palette here actually is more acceptable for a serious desktop application. But the problem is that everything is still too large. For example, this slider is way too big for a desktop app, doesn't make sense. And then there's a whole bunch of widgets that literally are meant for a mobile handheld UX. These bottom sheets here, great for scrolling with your thumb, make absolutely no sense in a desktop app. So that's where the framework leaves us. That's all we've got out of the framework, but we can look to the community for some help. And I would like to spotlight a member of our very own audience here today. Ruben, would you like to stand up and take credit for macOS UI? We have the creator here with us today. Thank you very much, Ruben, for all the work that you've done. And by the way, Godspeed with the new Apple liquid glass. But macOS UI is a package that Ruben created with contributions from others, which recreates essentially the Mac OS look and feel. This is kind of like what Cupertino would be if it was targeting the desktop. We have something similar for Windows, which is Fluent UI. You get a Windows native-ish, platform-ish look and feel. Now, that's great if you want to look like the underlying operating system, but what if you just want an attractive, kind of well-formulated widget kit that doesn't answer to any one operating system? Well, then we do have something like ShadCN UI. This is the Flutter port of the very popular web widget or component toolkit called ShadCN. And so far, this is doing a great job. This is one of the most popular widget kits in recent history. And there are some widgets in this kit that do work very well for desktop. I've shown you the calendar picker here, or the date picker. But even ShadCN UI is not specific to desktop. A lot of the effort still goes into mobile. And many of the widgets may not be quite appropriate for a desktop experience in terms of size and shape. So it's important for us to realize that desktop apps fundamentally need a greater variety of widgets. Like if you go look at the typical mobile widget kit, you've got maybe 20 different fundamental widgets in there. On desktop, if you're really filling it out, it's probably 50 or 100. There's just way more stuff we need to do in a desktop widget kit. So just from the screenshots that I showed you earlier, here's 3 tree menus just out of those screenshots alone. Nearly every desktop app finds a reason somewhere to have a tree menu, whether it's a file system like what we see from, I think VS Code is what we have on the left, or we have a kind of a middle ground with Obsidian in the middle where, yes, there are files associated with those notes, but it's also kind of a logical representation or grouping. And then all the way to Figma where there's no file association, but we still have a tree relationship for components, layers, frames, etc. Almost every desktop app eventually needs a menu like this. How about timelines? If you're doing anything with media, audio, video, animation, you need a timeline. These come out of the digital audio workstations from earlier, but also, of course, video editing, special effects, and even vector animations. You need a timeline so that you can control what happens over time, whether it's keyframes, clipping, etc. And how about tabs? Tabs are everywhere on desktop. Again, all these were just yanked out of the earlier screenshots that I showed you. You probably can't ship a desktop app without some kind of tab system. So we need a greater variety of widgets. And I would like to implore you to consider contributing to these widget kits, if not create some of your own. But before you go off in that direction, we should talk about differences in user experience between mobile and desktop, because you have different considerations and different implementations. Let's start by looking at mobile UX. What have all of us dealt with as mobile developers? Well, first, and this is just a random app from the Flutter marketing, I just want you to consider on a phone the idea of cause and effect. Pretty much anywhere that you tap on a screen, you're going to be able to see what effect you have because it's a tiny screen. You really can't lose track of what's happening. And when you tap or interact with gestures on mobile, there's a clear start, a pathway that you might drag, and a clear end. Okay, start, middle, and end. That's a constraint that we always have with gestures on mobile. Again, everything is big on mobile. It's big on mobile because the screen might be close to your face or far away. It might be tilted on the table next to you. And for that reason, we have high contrast colors and large shapes. Pretty much all text input on mobile goes through the software keyboard and through the input method editor. Generally speaking, in mobile apps, you are not notified and you do not respond to key presses. You are notified of content changes. That's a constraint on mobile. We will see that constraint is, you still have the same content edits, but there's a whole other dimension we have to consider on desktop. So let's switch over to desktop and look at what UX considerations we need to make over there. So cause and effect. Let's bring up Ableton again for music production. How many places could you tap in this app and have no idea what change you just caused if the UI doesn't show you? On desktop, you have to keep this in mind. Whenever a user initiates an action, you visually need to hold their hand to show them the consequences of those actions. Sticking with Ableton, let's talk about tap areas. We're going to use our little CSI trick here. We're going to do enhance, 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 and look at those buttons. They are absolutely tiny. And while Ableton might have exceptionally tiny buttons, the more you look at desktop apps, the more you realize that almost every button is tiny compared to mobile. Like physically, a user would not be able to tap on these on a phone, and yet this is kind of the standard size of a button in an application like Ableton. Also, I mentioned about gestures before on mobile, beginning, middle, end. On desktop, you get an entirely new interaction mode that happens before a gesture even begins, which is hover. And not only does it happen before a gesture, but as you can see in this example, you can hover and then leave and never start a gesture at all. Hover becomes its own interaction mode. And then, of course, shortcuts. Every desktop app has shortcuts, and those are based not on content edits, but instead a question of which physical keys are currently pressed. So, how do these consequences manifest? Focus and key presses are absolutely critical. Here's a calendar or date time selector that I created, and you'll notice that sure, I can tap to open it, tap to close it, but I can also I give it this blue border, and that happened when I pressed the tab key. The tab key gave the button focus, then I pressed enter, which because the button was focused, it opened a calendar, which then moved the focus into the calendar, and then I pressed escape, which the calendar then understood to mean exit the calendar. That is a combination of focus and key presses only, and users expect that on the desktop. But it gets even more complicated. How about traversal? Users expect that they can move around your user interface using the keyboard. So here with combinations of up, down, left, and right arrows, as well as tab and shift tab, not only can I move between days, I can select a day, I can also go up and navigate forward and backward in time between the months in the calendar. Hover is critical. It's not just a nice to have. Here's the editor from Slack. Every single button in the editor, first it's an icon button. There's no explanation built into what the button does, so every one of them needs a tooltip. You hover for a moment, it shows you the tooltip, and I told you about those shortcuts. Every app has shortcuts. Those are even included in those top tooltips. These are baseline expectations once you get to desktop. And shout out to Simon Lightfoot, who's running around here somewhere. There he is. There's Simon. So if we hover over Simon on Slack, we don't just get a tooltip. We get an entire window that pops up with an entirely separate layout where if we wanted to, we could even select the text, click on buttons, etc. And then here's an interesting one. As we move to the left, we hover over this divider that lets us slide left and right. We don't even know it's interactable until we hover over it. And there's a second example of that same phenomenon where we can't see the scroll bar until we hover over the menu. These are examples of UX practices by which you hide capabilities until the user indicates an interest in interacting with those capabilities. This becomes important because desktop apps do so many different things. If you make everything visible all the time, it's just too many options and there's not enough space to do it. So on desktop, we use hover to hide things that you don't need. And remember that the cursor is tiny. Unlike our fat thumbs on mobile, the cursor is really small. Now I've blown this button way up. This is actually a tiny little button that I created. But I have a transition animation here where not only does the icon slide to toggle between the two, but there's even a slight gradient that fades it in and out. On desktop, you can see this and you can appreciate it and it can be informative. It would have been pointless to do this on mobile because the user would never have seen what was happening behind his or her thumb. So now, hopefully I've convinced you that a lot of really important things happen on desktop and maybe you should build some yourself, and I've shown you things to keep in mind as you do. But let's take the final part of this presentation to dig into what Flutter actually offers to accomplish these goals. First is hover, and this is actually probably the easiest and simplest. We simply surround a widget with a mouse region widget. And the mouse region widget will allow you to provide two callbacks. One callback, which is invoked when the mouse goes into the bounds of the widget, and once that when the mouse leaves the bounds of the widget. And you can do anything you want. You can call set state to rebuild your widget tree. You can start and stop animations. You can call out to controllers or other logical pieces. Whatever you want, you can do it with the mouse region right there. Now, you may also need the exact XY position of the mouse or cursor when it's inside the bounds. I think you can accomplish that with on hover, but the docs do recommend a different approach. I think they recommend maybe a listener widget. I'll leave you to the docs to go figure that out. But if you have to, on hover is available as well. Now, one thing I didn't show here, which is relevant, is that you can also change the type of cursor. So normally you have the kind of pointer cursor, but then when you get to something clickable, you'll see the little hand with the finger to click. And we saw earlier the draggable pane where it turns into a left-right arrow. You can set that on the mouse region widget as well, and the cursor will automatically change as you move in and out of the region. Now, how about focus? In the most basic case, you can make something focusable by simply surrounding it with a focus widget. Unfortunately, simply surrounding your widget tree with a focus widget does not give you any control over focus. So in practice, this is insufficient to accomplish any of your focus goals. Instead, we need to go one step further. We need to create a focus node. A focus node is what allows you to actually request focus and release focus. But to start with, just to get a focus node into your widget tree, in your state class, you will create a focus node, either where you declare the variable or you can do it in init state. You do need to dispose your focus node because things will add listeners to it and those must be removed. And then finally, you pass that node to your focus widget. Now, a side note, you can actually manage focus entirely on your own if you want to. You don't need to pass it into a focus widget, but my recommendation would be that unless you need something special, give it to the focus widget, let the focus widget manage most of the details for you. But now what can we do with that focus node? Once you've done the setup on the slide before, you can now request focus. So you can say, you can ask Flutter and the operating system, both of which are involved with focus. You can say, I want this widget to retain focus or to receive it. You can also say that a widget with focus, you no longer want focus. You want to get rid of it. You don't even care where it goes. Just get it off of this text field, get it off of this button. And then finally, you can react to changes to focus. You can add a listener. Your focus node will be notified every time you gain or lose focus, and you can respond accordingly. So how do you decorate focus? Because again, one thing, when you're working on mobile and focus is kind of an afterthought, you just assume that focus decoration happens automatically. You're using Flutter's built-in text field. It just turns blue or whatever the moment it gets focused. But actually, that's a widget responsibility. You have to tell your widget how to decorate when it receives focus. In the simplest case, we can have, for example, a decorated box with a border. And when our node has focus, we give that border the color blue. And when it's not focused, we make it transparent. Now, I'm curious, does anyone know why I give it a transparent border without focus instead of getting rid of the border entirely? Simon. Size change. And what happens with size change? Okay, so Simon says that when the border disappears, if there is no border, you're going to get a slightly smaller rectangle. And when the border comes back, it's slightly bigger by whatever the width of the border. And that is correct. So as the user's pressing tab or cycling through focus, you do not want your button to get slightly larger and slightly smaller, or your text field slightly larger or slightly smaller. So we always give it a border and we just switch between a color and being invisible. But this still begs the question, what happens when we gain or lose focus? I mean, okay, we built the tree, but how do we rebuild when focus changes? And you've got multiple options here, but perhaps the easiest one in the middle of a widget tree is to use a listenable builder. A listenable builder, we can pass in the focus node as the listenable, and its child tree will rebuild every time the focus node changes, which means every time it gains focus, every time it loses focus, we rebuild our decorated box and we go from blue to transparent, transparent to blue. But you can also take more control over this process if you want as well. You can kind of directly control it by adding a listener to your focus node, like we talked about earlier. And in that listener, you can check, did we go from not focused to focused? Did we go from focused to not focused? And then you can call set state directly. This also gives you the chance to switch any other local properties that you want to correspond to the focus state. Also, we don't just have to rebuild the tree. We don't have to just go blue to transparent immediately. We can actually start and stop or start and reverse an animation. So imagine that this focus animation animates from transparent to fully blue and then fully blue back to transparent. We start this animation when we gain focus and the focus border fades in. And then whenever we lose focus, we reverse the animation and it fades back out. And this is actually another detail about desktop that you're going to notice. Almost everything on desktop is animated at least a little bit. Even if it's 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds of minor details, desktop apps almost always animate changes. How about traversal? So, okay, one thing has focus or it doesn't, but what about moving focus around? You saw earlier the calendar example. That required a custom implementation of traversal, but let me show you just how to choose among the policies that are built into Flutter. In whatever part of your widget tree you want to control the movement of focus, you surround that area with a focus group. The focus group widget takes a policy. Flutter gives you two policies out of the box. The first one is a reading order policy. That policy inspects the actual render objects on the screen and tries to move from left to right, top to bottom. Unless your reading order is reversed. If you're in a right to left language, then it starts at the right, it goes to the left, and then top to bottom. That's your reading order. The second option is a widget order, and this one has nothing to do with the actual content as it appears. It literally traverses down your widget tree. And whatever order it hits the focus nodes going down your tree, that's the order moving forward. And then that reverse order is how you move back. And that, again, depends entirely on how you choose to structure your widget tree. Traversal scope. In the calendar example earlier when we were moving around, you actually could not escape the calendar. No combination of arrow keys or tab keys would take the focus out of the calendar, because that would essentially be a bug. The user expects to be able to go up, 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 and then circle back around to the bottom, or go down and circle back to the top. There should be no way to escape it. And the way you accomplish that in Flutter is with a focus scope. So the moment that you surround your widget tree with a focus scope, you're telling Flutter, I will manually move focus out of this. Do not allow any other focus traversal to escape this widget tree. All right, key presses. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this yet or not, but to be absolutely clear, the entire purpose of focus is to decide what responds to key presses. That's actually the whole reason it exists. We decorate things and undecorate things and traverse it to decide which part of the widget tree actually responds to key presses like arrow keys, enter keys, escape keys, tab keys, spacebar. So let's actually look at how to handle key presses. This is the most direct way you can respond to a physical key press. Inside of a focus widget, or even a focus scope widget, there's a callback called onKeyEvent. That event receives the focus node it corresponds to and whatever key was pressed. And the way that you actually decide what to do is you need to check the type of event that you're given. This is actually a full class level type check. You can either get a key down event, a key up event, or there's a middle ground where the user presses and holds the key and the operating system keeps reporting it over and over, which is known as a key repeat. Again, you can take whatever action you want and respond to those key presses. You can also choose not to respond. So this is a bubbling system. If you don't respond, something above you gets to respond. So you decide, are we handling this or do we not care? And it can bubble further up that tree. But direct handling within focus nodes is not the only mechanism that we have in Flutter. Flutter has a concept of shortcuts and actions. And let's take a look at how you can set those up. When you're using shortcuts and actions, the first thing you're going to do is start by identifying these very generic user behaviors. We call them intents. So here we've defined the concept of a previous intent and a next intent. Now, previous what, next what, who knows? These are abstract concepts. The user has said, I want to go the previous of something, I want to go the next of something. And then we get to the first step in a two-step process. We need to map physical keys to those intentions. And it's totally up to you what this mapping is. In this case, we're mapping the left arrow key to the previous intent and the right arrow key to the next intent. Now, there's a bit of boilerplate around this, but this is the shortcuts widget, which is provided by Flutter in the framework. And the shortcuts widget expects a map that maps essentially a key combination to a particular intent. Now, once you've defined that mapping, those intents are fired, but fired to what? What acts on those intents? And that brings us to step 2 in this process, actions. This is another widget. And somewhat oddly, this widget goes below your shortcuts widget, not above it. I know we're used to creating ancestor widgets when we want one widget to talk to another. This has the inverted relationship. Shortcuts goes somewhere higher than actions. But actions is the other half, where in the actions widget, we say, here's an intent that might be generated. And when that intent is generated, here's the actual implementation of what we want to do. So in this case, we get the previous intent. Imagine we have a carousel controller. An image carousel is like a horizontally scrolling set of images. So imagine we have a carousel controller. We'll call previous on that controller, or we'll call next on that controller if we get a next intent. This is the combination of shortcuts to actions, and what corresponds between them are intents. Now, to be clear, you do not need to use shortcuts and actions. These do not deprecate the focus capability. A couple things you should be thinking is, as always, what is simpler and easier for our use case? But then also, are you going to want to override any of these behaviors? If you handle a key press at exactly the place where it happens, if you implement that focus node key event, there's not going to be any way to override that. The action that you implement is what's going to happen, period. But if you use shortcuts and actions widgets, because they have positions in the widget tree, you can insert other shortcuts and other actions to supersede. You have a priority system. So for example, at the application level of your entire window, maybe Command S means save. But then imagine that you have a document editor inside of your app. Command S might do something else entirely. So same key combination, different intent and different response. So desktop widgets for Flutter. If you leave here with just a few things today, first understand that mobile UX is not desktop UX. Desktop deserves its own treatment. And desktop is arguably Flutter's greatest untapped market in terms of potential value that you can ship to customers. And we need more widget kits. If we don't have the baseline widgets, product teams are not going to pick up Flutter for desktop. They're going to go somewhere else that already has all these widgets. So if we want this industry to grow, we need to start by building the building blocks, and then we recruit the product teams. And that's on us here as a community. The Flutter organization is not moving on this, and so we build it or nobody does. And as you contribute to those kits, which hopefully you do, remember, everything on desktop is smaller. Users expect hover effects. Users expect keyboard shortcuts. And you should hide things the user doesn't currently care about. And with that, happy widget kitting, and thank you for being here and listening. Happy to take questions. Any questions? Simon, do you have a question? You're standing up and I saw you, so I'm calling on you. No? Okay. But any questions from the audience?
We get one common desktop widget kit that exists, like whether it's the KDE widget kit or the GNOME widget kit or GTK, Qt, which one would you want first?
So I couldn't quite hear that, but you listed off some other. Well, it sounds.
Yeah, if we were going to port like one of those design languages to Flutter, which one would you like first?
Honestly, I would probably grab a popular application and start recreating from there. So a Figma, a Photoshop, and After Effects, if you build out all those pieces, one, you'll already know right off the bat where they can be applied. And two, I think they'll tend to lead into other widgets that are easily identifiable. Whereas if you take some other existing kit, you can hope that there's value behind those widgets, but you don't necessarily know. Maybe no one's really using some of those widgets, and so you spend time creating things that people won't necessarily use. That'd be my just personal 2 cents on that. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you very much.